Welcome to this Tibet Talk Europe. Break the silence. Tibet was never part of China. Tibet Talks Europe is a series of online conversations on Tibet with leading thinkers, scholars and activists. And today we talk with Michael van Walt van Praag about his latest book, Tibet Brief 2020. Michael, welcome. Michael van Walt is an international lawyer specialized in conflict resolution, senior fellow at Golden Gate State University and author of several books on the status of Tibet, including Sacred Mandates and Tibet, the Legal Question, Status, Rights and Prospects in International Law. Michael has advised the Tibetan government in exile on the negotiations with China. In April last year, Michael was knighted as a commander in the Order of Orange Nassau for his contribution to conflict resolution. In this Tibet talk, we discuss Tibet Brief 2020, the culmination of 10 years of research involving scholars of Manchu, Mongol, Chinese and Tibetan history. During the talk, you can pose your questions in the chat. We can't promise to answer them all, but we'll do our best. Michael, 10 years of research, that is like a labor of love and an enormous amount of work. Before we delve into the substance of this book, I'd like to ask you a personal question. What motivated you to write this book?
Thank you, Krista, and thank you for inviting me to discuss Tibet Brief 2020 with you on this ICT platform. Well, Mick Boltjes, the book's co-author, and I mediate and we facilitate intrastate peace processes. And a recurring obstacle we've had to deal with concerns conflicting perceptions of history. So opposing sides in conflicts can view their history very differently, and that informs their understanding of their rights, their sense of entitlement, the type of resolution they're determined to achieve. This is quite common, but there's hardly any guidelines available for mediators on how to deal with deadlock caused by negotiators who don't move beyond their historical narratives. So we set out to develop general strategies to address this problem. And we chose Asia as our first case study. And it became clear right away that we really had to deeply delve into the history itself. Because if you're going to understand how parties in conflicts today interpret the historical relations they had, and that they interpret them so radically differently, we knew we would have to understand the worldviews that existed at the time, the systems that were in place that legitimized rule and informed the nature of relations between political actors, also at the time. And so this process, as you said, with scholars from different parts of the world, led to the discovery of 3 separate legal systems in Asia that regulated how power was lawfully exercised and how relations among political actors were conducted and interpreted. And so there was not 1, but 3 legal orders of equal importance. And this is significant because today we're used to having 1 global international legal system that guides international relations. But so before the 20th century, there were 3. And each of them was fundamentally different from the other and different from the current system that we have. And so these findings and the ramifications of it helped us to design a methodology for mediators. But it also had immediate relevance for the Sino-Tibetan conflict. As you recall, at the time, the negotiations between the Tibetans and Chinese, the delegations that had met in Beijing primarily, had broken down. And the PRC demanded that the Dalai Lama publicly accept the PRC's historical narrative on Tibet, that Tibet had always been a part of China, as a precondition for future negotiations on substance. So disagreement on history had become or had been made a major obstacle to prospects of meaningful dialogue and negotiations between China and the Tibetans. So we decided to do a follow-up project, zooming in specifically on the crux of the historical disagreement, namely the question whether, and if so when, Tibet had in the past been a part of China. So this answers what motivated us to do this research, which is the first part of your question. And regarding the second part, what motivated us to write this book, I'll just shift from the past to the present for a moment. You may have noticed that the audience that the book is trying to reach is not primarily Tibetan or Chinese, but rather policymakers and opinion makers around the world. And think, for example, of Asia and China desks at foreign affairs ministries, in newspapers, think tanks, etc. So we asked ourselves the question, how our research findings could be most effectively used to promote a resolution of the conflict. And we came to the conclusion that unless the international community acts in accordance with the legal implications of the historical findings, Beijing will really have zero incentive to enter into dialogue with the Tibetans to resolve the conflict. And so the book is meant as a resource, but also as a call to action, to course correct in that direction.
Yeah. Very good, Michael. So let's delve into the substance of the book then, and go to that claim, as you said, China's claim to sovereignty over Tibet. China bases its claim to sovereignty over Tibet on the fact that Tibet was part of the Mongol Empire. That is also what your book starts with, the beginning of the book. Now, why, according to you and according to the book, why is this argument not correct?
Yes, the PRC claims that Tibet was incorporated into China by the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century and has been part of China since. Therefore, the argument goes, the PRC simply inherited Tibet from its predecessors. Now, the inheritance argument is clever, as it gives a semblance of legitimacy to China's military takeover of Tibet in 1951. The international law at the time already prohibited aggression and acquisition of territory by the use of force. So if Beijing could convince the world that Tibet already belonged to China because it always had, it could not be accused of illegally trying to annex Tibet. And this is what it set out to do. So the PRC built a historical case in the form of a historical narrative that starts at the time of the Mongol Empire. This narrative is not only Sino-centric and self-serving, it's also factually incorrect and in many places misleading. One of the problems with it is that the PRC retroactively appropriates non-Chinese empires, most importantly the Mongol and the Qing empires, and designates them as Chinese and China. The Mongol and Qing empires were, of course, not Chinese. They were both Inner Asian, Mongol and Manchu respectively. And this includes the Yuan dynasty, which was simply part of the Mongol Empire, namely the Chinese inhabited part. The rulers of these empires conquered, occupied, and ruled China and the Chinese for centuries, but as part of a much larger dominions. Their authority reached deep into Inner Asia, for example, and extended to the Tibetan plateau as well. But by retroactively appropriating these foreign empires, and with it their territorial scope, as Chinese, the PRC laid the foundation for its argument that it simply inherited sovereignty over Tibet from its predecessors. Now that is a trick. Een trucje is it. So yes, Tibet was part of the Mongol Empire, which stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe and the Middle East, as you saw on the map. But this in no way leads to the notion that the PRC can claim to have inherited Mongol rights over Tibet, whatever they might have been. That's absurd. So, in fact, if you carefully examine Mongolian, Manchu, Tibetan, and Chinese sources, you find that Tibet was in reality, historically, never a part of China. This doesn't mean that Tibet was always an independent state in the modern sense of the term. Tibet's relations with the Mongol, Manchu, and British empires did entail different forms of dependency, but none of those relations entailed the incorporation of Tibet into China. And as for the Republic of China, which unilaterally claimed Tibet as part of that republic from its inception in 1912, it was entirely unable to establish any authority in or over Tibet, leaving its claim completely empty. In reality, during that period, Tibet was an independent state, both de facto and de jure, which means that it was independent when the PRC was founded in 1949 and when the People's Liberation Army invaded it soon after. So let me conclude this somewhat lengthy answer to your question with just this following observation. The difference in perception of history by Tibetans and Chinese today can in part be explained by the fact that all through history, they each not only interpreted relations between themselves and with other political actors from the perspective of their own worldview, they also recorded them in accordance with that worldview. And the legal orders in place in Asia at the time allowed for that. They allowed for simultaneous different interpretations of relations to exist side by side. So if you look at the contemporaneous historical sources, they reflect these different realities. But that does not explain the nature of the PRC's historical narrative regarding Tibet, because those same contemporaneous Chinese historical sources, such as the official dynastic histories, hardly ever mention Tibet. And if they did, they never represented Tibet as an integral part of China. Instead, they used words that signify, for example, that it was a foreign polity, at times listing it in the same category as, for example, Persia, and yes, you guessed it, Holland.
Yeah.
So the PRC's historical narrative really needs to be understood for what it is, a strategy to legitimize the PRC's current expansive borders and its presence in Tibet. In the book, we scrutinized all claims in that narrative of the PRC, and they simply don't hold up. And this is because, as China's own historical sources show, Tibet was historically, in fact, never a part of China.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I found that very interesting when reading the book, that you say that the official records actually speak about Tibet as a foreign entity on par with other, well, what are now foreign countries. Very, very interesting. And yes, your book does provide a very balanced views. It really lays out how things were and what the different interpretations were. Now, what do you think? What implications does the conclusion that Tibet was never part of China, because that is the main conclusion of the book, what implications does it have for the obligations of states? In your introduction, you mentioned that this aspect of the implications for the obligations of states, how to act, but also how not to act, are a major part of the relevance, a major part of the reason why actually you wanted to write this book. So could you say something about these obligations of states that follow from your conclusion?
Yes, that is an important part of the reason for writing the book, and it takes up an important part of the book. Well, because Tibet was historically not a part of China, and because it had been an independent state in the modern legal sense for almost 4 decades, when the PRC invaded and took Tibet by force, Tibet became an occupied country, and it still is today. The Dutch can relate to the experience of being under occupation, because the Netherlands was, of course, occupied during World War II. But there's also another aspect of being occupied that people may be less familiar with. And Tibet is occupied also legally speaking. And that has consequences for the rest of the world. So international law, for example, stipulates that the People's Republic of China is obligated to end the occupation of Tibet and to permit the Tibetans to freely exercise their full right to self-determination. China is also prohibited from settling Chinese in Tibet and from exploiting Tibet's resources. International law also stipulates that all of our governments are prohibited actually from recognizing the illegal annexation of Tibet by China. And they're prohibited from cooperating with or assisting Beijing in any way in maintaining its rule of Tibet. Because Tibet is an occupied country and the Sino-Tibetan conflict is an international one and not China's internal affair, states may not treat Tibet as part of China. And that's an important conclusion of the book. All states, all governments are also required to refrain from aiding and abetting the exploitation of Tibet's natural resources without the permission of the Tibetans, since those resources belong solely to the Tibetan people, according to international law. And incidentally, this norm was recently reaffirmed by the European Court of Justice in regard to the resources of Western Sahara, which is occupied by Morocco. And lastly, our governments also have the positive duty to help bring about an end to the occupation of Tibet, a solution to the Sino-Tibetan conflict, and to permit and respect the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. That all in a nutshell. And sadly, very little of any of this is happening today. And that's why we're using this book and urging significant course correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But Michael, the events we're talking about, they have taken place so long ago. Is it still relevant to course correct?
Yeah, the invasion of Tibet happened a long time ago, but Tibet is still occupied. You know, the Netherlands was occupied for 5 years, but we were fortunate that foreign powers came to our rescue. The continued occupation of Tibet is happening on our watch, and it has for 70 years now. Our governments are in fact medeplichtig. They're accessories after the fact. In Dutch that translates weirdly as medeplichtig na het feit. But an accessory after the fact is someone who assists a person who has committed a crime after the person has committed it with the intent to help the person avoid punishment. And in effect, that is what our governments are doing. And this includes the Dutch government. The Dutch government looks the other way. It uses a language that exonerates China so as not to upset it. And when pressed on the matter, it avoids responsibility by conveniently pointing to the European decision-making process. I realize these are harsh words on my part. You know, does the Netherlands intentionally help the PRC get away with annexation of a neighboring country by force? I'd really like to stand corrected. I really would, and I extend hereby an invitation to be corrected. I don't know about you, Krista, but this impacts me personally. You know, the Dutch Foreign Ministry projects The Hague as the capital of peace and justice. It projects international law as a policy priority. You mentioned I was awarded the distinction of Commandeur of the Order van Oranje Nassau last spring. And because of COVID, I received the actual medal just a few months ago in San Francisco in the backyard of the Netherlands Consul General's residence. Do you remember, Krista? You were there on Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a beautiful ceremony at a politically and socially challenging moment, especially in the US, just weeks before the election. But yeah. I'm bringing this up because the reasons I was awarded the distinction, which, as you mentioned, included my contribution to prevention and resolution of conflicts, my work in advancing rights and self-determination of oppressed peoples, but also and specifically, and here I quote the Consul General, my, and I quote, exceptional role in international law, which is a priority of the Dutch Foreign Ministry, end of quote. Now, I remember it felt gratifying, not only to be recognized for my work, but it also felt good that my country explicitly endorsed values that are important to me. It felt good to be Dutch that afternoon there in the backyard of the Consul General's garden. But actions speak louder than words. And in the specific case of Tibet, the Netherlands does not uphold the international rule of law, and it does not live up to its declared values and principles. And so I think we really must do better. And lastly, our governments also need to course correct, because decades of appeasement and self-censorship have enabled China to become a bully. I believe that China's expansionism and aggressive behavior towards India, Bhutan, now in the South China Sea, as well as its bullying and interference in Nepal, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, all accompanied by a sense of entitlement, are directly related to how the international community has treated and still treats China's invasion and occupation of Tibet. Beijing has learned that it can get away with territorial expansion over time if it consistently pushes a self-serving historical narrative and punishes those who challenge it. So I think it really is high time that we speak up, that we speak truth to power, as it were.
Michael, these are indeed strong words, and thank you for this answer. But I am going to play a little bit of devil's advocate, because, I mean, Tibet has been under, using your words, illegal occupation now for more than 70 years. China has very firmly effective control over the territory. We can't argue with that. Now, doesn't that change Tibet's legal status at some point?
We can't argue with that. It's a very important question and an important point you make. But international law, in force at least since the Second World War, makes clear that no state can acquire sovereignty over another territory, over a territory that belongs to another country, through the use of force, period. And because this norm is so fundamental, China's continued occupation of Tibet cannot be legitimized by the passage of time, no matter how long. That's simple.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. I think we're having some network problems. At least I am not seeing you at the moment. I hope the viewers at home will see both of us. But we will continue this talk because I think our audio is good, and hope that our videos will resume as soon as possible. I apologize for this inconvenience, but this is part of working online these days. We can't do anything about that. Michael, can I ask you, moving to the present from the historical narrative, the Dalai Lama has decided to opt for genuine autonomy and not to ask any longer for independence. Now, is this why we and also the media and governments have stopped referring to Tibet as an occupied country and to the Sino-Tibetan conflict? I mean, in general now, Tibetans are often referred to as minorities or even as religious minorities. And the Tibetan conflict is often referred to as the Tibet issue. How do you see this?
I think that different people have stopped calling Tibet what it is, namely an occupied country, for different reasons. But ultimately, I think it boils down to the effect of decades of relentless Chinese propaganda and fear of angering China. First, I think you're referring to the fact that Dharamsala changed its tone and word choice during the 10-year negotiation period, shortly after 2000 and until 2010.
Yeah.
In that period, the Tibetan leadership made a conscious choice to accommodate China's sensitivities in order to give the talks every possible chance of success.
Michael, sorry to interrupt. I think we have a picture of some of those talks. Maybe it can be put on the screen while we are talking. Please continue.
Yes, I can see the pictures. And in fact, the Dharamsala would often say it would leave no stone unturned to make the talks have a chance of success. And in that same period, our governments and politicians also abandoned most expressions and words that rub Beijing the wrong way, whether this was done in support of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue or for other reasons, or for selfish reasons. And it's kind of stayed that way. Tibetan movement also followed suit to some extent. It's become less vocal, somewhat self-censoring, and careless when it comes to its word choice. So you're right, Krista. Tibetans are nowadays often referred to as religious or ethnic minority. Similarly, we see Tibet being referred to as a Western province in some newspapers. And the conflict is referred to merely as a Tibet issue, as you say, which is a completely meaningless and non-committal term.
Yep.
Such terminology actually reinforces the Chinese narrative. And it denies the Tibetan people its proper status and implicitly also its right to self-determination. Now, I can see that being mindful of using appropriate and truthful language may sound frivolous to some people, but it's not. I mean, consider this. Beijing, on its part, diligently uses the language and arguments of international law to persuade the world that its forceful incorporation of Tibet is lawful. It consistently deploys a carefully selected vocabulary when talking about Tibet and the Tibetans. This vocabulary not only fits its historical narrative and is intended to, it is deliberately chosen because it assigns legal consequences when that vocabulary is adopted by others. And the fact that this is to a large extent happening today is a huge problem that can only be solved by not adopting China's vocabulary and by being mindful to use language that expresses the true nature of the conflict instead.
I think we all understand what you're saying, Michael. Those of us who are watching or working in international diplomacy definitely recognize this. Now, you mentioned the term self-determination. How does self-determination, the right to self-determine, apply to the Tibetans today? Is it still applicable? It was mentioned in old UN resolutions, but what about today? Is that right still applicable?
Self-determination, as you know, is a right of a people to choose its own political status, its own social and economic and cultural development without outside interference. That's the accepted UN definition of self-determination. It also entails the right to manage and dispose of natural resources in that people's territory. And Tibetans as a people possess this right. And Tibetans as a people are being denied its exercise. The international community was, as you mentioned at one time, vocal about this. The UN General Assembly passed the resolution calling for the implementation of Tibetan people's right to self-determination, but more recently governments have fallen silent on the matter. International law requires that the People's Republic of China allow the Tibetans to exercise this right and obligates other states to respect it. And so I think that affirming this as part of our government's policies on Tibet could go a long way towards, again, incentivizing the PRC to negotiate a mutually agreeable status for Tibet.
And that is, of course, what we are all aiming to achieve,
Yes.
to get the negotiations off the ground again, and to aim for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Now, I would
Precisely.
suggest we're coming to the last question before we turn to the questions of the audience, because I could imagine that there are lots of questions about this topic. In an interview about the book, about Tibet Brief 2020, you have said that, and I quote, "For negotiations to have a chance, governments need to be aware of the true nature of the conflict and the historical relations between Tibet and China." Now, you have already said something about it in various answers that you have given, but could you just elaborate a little bit further on this? I mean, and how do you see the future of a negotiated solution to the Sino-Tibetan conflict?
Yes, in the first place, prospects for negotiations are affected by Beijing's perceived need to negotiate. Mm-hmm. So if Beijing believes it needs to negotiate, it will do so. If it doesn't, it will not. As long as Beijing senses that the international community buys into its argument that it has legitimate grounds to rule Tibet, it doesn't feel pressured either to negotiate with the Tibetan leadership, nor to change its policies in Tibet on the ground to satisfy Tibetan needs there. So I think that is fundamental. By getting us to accept the notion that Tibet may have been a part of China historically, Beijing is close to having successfully changed the appearance of its presence in Tibet to that of a legitimate ruler, and of the Sino-Tibetan conflict to that of an internal Chinese matter. And our governments appear to go along with it, limiting their asks largely to respect for human rights, especially cultural and religious ones. Governments even couch their support for Sino-Tibetan talks on autonomy in cultural and religious terms instead of political ones. All of this contributes to negating the real nature of the conflict and of China's presence in Tibet. And as a consequence, it robs the Tibetans, it takes away from the Tibetans whatever leverage they have in an already highly asymmetric negotiation situation. So in my opinion, negotiations can only be successful if proper conditions are created for them. There are many things that can be done for this. But three come to mind immediately. One, governments must stop making statements that Tibet is part of China to please Beijing. They should be vocal again about Tibet's right to self-determination. We've talked about that. And they should no longer accept Beijing's core interest trap. And let me explain core interest for those who are not familiar with it. China has designated Tibet, Taiwan, and Xinjiang as its core interests. And it demands that its positions and interests regarding these regions must be accepted and respected by all governments as a prerequisite for friendly bilateral relations with China. Most recently, Beijing added the South China Sea to its list of core interests, and I wouldn't be surprised if soon they wouldn't add Hong Kong as well. The Chinese government uses this mechanism to instill fear of angering China, which has led many governments to comply with its demands about who to meet and who not to meet, and what to say and what not to say, and to self-censor. So I think that in order to create the conditions for negotiations to take place at all, we need collective effort. Otherwise, negotiations will not have a chance.
Thank you, Michael. I hope there are government representatives listening to this talk, or will be listening to this talk later on when they watch the video. And I hope that they will take what you have told us so far to heart. Now, I also like to turn now to the audience to see if any questions have been put into the chat. So I like to ask my colleague Inge Hoekstra, there she is. Inge, welcome. Who has kept track of the questions in the chat to post some of these questions to you. Inge, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Christa and Michiel van Walt, for this very interesting talk. We have had many questions in our Facebook chat. Unfortunately, the video of Michael has turned off due to network issues, but we were able to hear very well. So we have some questions. One very interesting question that relates to what you just mentioned. Hopefully governments are watching. A question by Nicole Sprokel. She mentions, I don't think that the Dutch government or the EU consider Tibet as an occupied country. Are there any states that do recognize this blatant denial of international law? And shouldn't this be brought to the International Court for Justice? It's a question for Michael.
It's a very good question. Yes, I agree that most countries in Europe have expressed themselves. Not all countries have expressed an explicit position on whether they consider Tibet to be an occupied country or not, and exactly what its status is. But for those countries that have, neither the Netherlands nor other countries in Europe that I'm aware of have recognized Tibet to be an occupied country. You may recall that in, I think now in 1992, the US Congress passed legislation, and in it, expressed the sense of Congress that Tibet was an illegally occupied country, that Tibet had been independent, it was an illegally occupied country, and a number of other things in that legislation. And recently, in the latest legislation that the US Congress passed, this past year in 2020, they referred back to that legislation and other legislation in the US, but they referred back to it specifically, which can be interpreted as a reincorporation of the text of that legislation as well. And interestingly, also in a report of the Department of State, again in the US, in December of last year, Tibet was referred to as an occupied country. In India, the Ministry of Home Affairs, in one of its official Tibet policy guidelines, which was published in the form of a booklet later, also refers to Tibet as an occupied country. So there, and for the rest, I don't know about all other countries, but it is true that it is not being generally recognized as an occupied country, and this is precisely why we are trying to inform the international community of the reality of the situation, in particular in international legal terms, and on their obligation, actually, of not recognizing Tibet as part of China. This is a very fundamental norm of international law, that when a country is seized by force by another country, the rest of the international community is not permitted to recognize that illegal annexation. And that is a message that we really want for the world to hear and for it to catch on.
Yes, very clear. Thank you for this answer, Michael. I think this covers it very well. We have a lot of questions in the Facebook chat, but there's one question in particular that from somebody in the audience that would like to go in to a question that Krista has posed to you earlier a little bit deeper. So Ms. Weiss-Kolkin is asking, as an appendix to the question on self-determination, how can we deal with self-determination when there is such a strong presence of China in Tibet? So how can we deal with that, and how can the international community contribute to that, as a follow-up question?
Thank you. Yes, the practical situation that China is in authority in Tibet, exercises its power in Tibet, and of course that it has a great amount of power internationally, politically, militarily, economically, are all make the situation difficult, and this is precisely the big challenge that we have been facing now for so many years. The right to self-determination is a right actually that is it is not dependent on the narrative that Tibet was an independent country when it was invaded. So these are two, if you like, these are two separate issues that reinforce each other, but Tibet is, regardless of that, regardless of its history, the Tibetans as a people have the right to self-determination. So what can the international community do about it? Tibetans inside Tibet cannot do that much about it because of the repressive regime, the impossibility of protesting without being arrested right away, etc. The outside world can do a lot. The outside world, the first thing it can do, and perhaps the most important, is simply to express, to voice its support for the Tibetans' exercise of their right to self-determination. It's just like expressing support for individuals' free speech. We do it all the time when it's being repressed in other countries. Self-determination is also a human right. It's a fundamental human right. It's in the very first article of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's fundamental. And yet we are afraid of expressing support for the implementation of that right. And this comes because many countries are afraid that it may be creating difficulties within their own countries. There may be a minority or an ethnic group in their country or an indigenous people that may want to claim the right to self-determination as well. And as a result, the way that the right to self-determination has been defined or is being presented nowadays is quite restrictive. And I won't go into that in detail, because as far as the Tibetans are concerned, no matter how restrictively the right to self-determination is defined, is presented, the Tibetans have the full right to self-determination, just as the people of the Western Sahara have it, just as the East Timorese had it before they regained their independence. So the Tibetan case is a very clear-cut case of self-determination rights, with the full range of choices in terms of what status they may want to choose. And so, yes, the best we can do, or the most important we can do, I think, is to speak out about it. Governments should speak out about it. They should ideally adopt resolutions on it, whether it's in parliaments or in international or regional fora, but they should be vocal about it instead of silent about it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for answering this question regarding self-determination and what internationally could be done for Tibetans. Now I would like to pose a question that's very relevant right now. And this is a question posed by a couple of our audience. So the question is regarding the occupation of Tibet, and they draw the same line for East Turkestan. So the question I would like to pose, let me see, there are so many. So since there's much attention being given to the situation of the Uyghurs at this time, is there a parallel that can be drawn to the situation with the occupation of East Turkestan by China to Tibet?
I have to answer the question first by saying that I'm no expert on East Turkestan, especially not on East Turkestan history. but I really don't have that the knowledge the way that I do when it comes to Tibet or even to other parts of in Asia like Mongolia, which I've studied in much more detail. So I can't really make clear comparisons. What I do know is that the history is different, and therefore you can't draw the same conclusions that I have or that we have in regard to Tibet to East Turkestan. In terms of the right to self-determination, again, I'm no expert on East Turkestan, but I would my strong assumption is that if I were to study it, I would find that the people of East Turkestan have the right to self-determination. And part of the reason why I say that with considerable confidence is that one of the criteria for full right to self-determination that has actually been developed more recently, rather than in the original way in which self-determination was formulated, has to do with the systematic and long-term human rights abuses against a people as a people, or as a group. And I mean, there's no denial today when we see the reports that come from East Turkestan about the treatment of the Uyghurs and of other non-Chinese in East Turkestan. So, but as I say, that is a not fully informed response. But in other words, in terms of the self-determination right, I think both peoples have a very strong case for self-determination.
Clear. Thank you. I think there is time for one more question before we round off this Q&A. And before we do, I want to thank all the people in the audience for posing all of these questions. And if your question wasn't answered, we will definitely try to answer them in the chat. One question that was posed is, why did other areas that were part of the Mongol Empire become independent, but Tibet did not? So why is China so set on occupying Tibet?
Also a very good question and a very interesting one. Some areas that were part of the Mongol Empire, some parts that were part of the Qing Empire, are today part of the PRC as well. The Manchu region, what is called Inner Mongolia or Southern Mongolia. Obviously, we just talked about it, East Turkestan. And some parts not. I mean, again, if you think of the map of the Mongolian Empire, yes, most of the Mongol Empire ended up differently. I mean, all of Central Asia, what we call Central Asia today, which is mainly the Islamic part countries, the independent countries of the former Soviet Union, are independent today. Mongolia is independent today. I think, I mean, it's been clear that China would have wanted to also break Mongolia into the first the Republic of China and then the PRC, but it couldn't because the Mongolians were very firm on not wanting to be part of China, but also because they received support from Russia, from the Soviet Union. I think it's very likely that Mongolia would have been invaded by the PRC had they not had the support at the time, for self-interest reasons, of the Soviet Union. And as for some of the other areas in Central Asia, the now independent republics of Central Asia, again, I think that their history was tied to some extent to the Ottoman Empire and later to the Russian Empire and then to the Soviet Union. And so their fate was different. Had Tibet had a stronger friend in the British Empire and later in India, they could have played the same role as Russia did. Again, probably out of self-interest, because that's usually what big countries do. But it could have had the effect that Tibet would not have been invaded by the PRC. But Tibet really did not have a strong sponsor, if you like, outside that was able to help. And Tibet is not a big country. It did not have an army to speak of. I mean, it had 10,000 troops, very small army. And so it was a very easy prey for China, especially after India's independence. There was not much likelihood that there would be a major country coming to Tibet's help. And if you recall, Tibet was invaded exactly at the time that the war broke out in Korea, in which China was implicated, the United States was implicated, the UN was implicated. And so China used, I think, that opportunity as well. It was unlikely that any power was going to be fighting two wars on two different fronts. And yes, so it is the result of different power political equations in different parts of the world. And Tibet is extremely strategically important for China, which is the reason why it went in there and why it is so keen to hold on to Tibet.
I think we've come to the end of the questions, Inge, or are there more questions? We can have one more.
Yeah, do we have one more?
Yes, let's do one more, definitely.
One interesting question came in regarding your book. So people are thanking you, by the way, for all of answering all of their questions. Regarding your book, they mentioned these days Tibet is more and more sidelined in the international community. And how can your book, Tibet 2020, help to effectively reverse this so that Tibet is not sidelined in the international community?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we noticed that it doesn't appear in the newspapers or on television or in other ways as often as it did in the past. Yeah. I think part of it may have been, well, there's a fatigue. As Krista said in one of the questions, the invasion happened a very long time ago. There is this kind of sense that, you know, it's a fait accompli. Can we really change things? China is such a strong power. It's only getting stronger. So, you know, is this not a lost cause? And I hear this very often from people. And the only thing I can say to that is this. The only thing that we can be certain of is that everything changes. That's our only certainty in life. And nobody, or very few people, I think, would have thought that the Baltic states would ever have been independent again, would have regained their independence. And yet it happened. The Soviet Union changed. It broke up. And it actually broke up because, I mean, ultimately it broke up because Yeltsin declared the independence of Russia from the Soviet Union. But that's more a technical thing than something else. But the Baltic states were very strong agents that led to the realization within the Soviet Union that there was a need for this breakup. East Timor, Krista, you and I, we were both in East Timor when East Timor became independent, helping them with the transition to independence. And when we were advocating on behalf of the East Timorese for 25 years during their occupation, we got this same response again and again. Indonesia is a huge country. East Timor is a tiny island. The international community was not really pressing for a resolution of that conflict. And yet it happened. It happened because the determination of the people on the ground continued, because there was diplomatic engagement by the East Timorese, same in regard to the Baltic states. So yes, things change, and the way to ensure that Tibet is back on the international agenda is really for those that advocate for Tibetans to make sure that it gets back on the agenda, but that it gets back on the agenda properly, and really push governments and others to do that. And again, our interest in writing the book is not an advocacy interest in terms of supporting one particular solution above another solution, but is only to say you're not going to have negotiations, and the conflict is not going to be resolved unless you really face the fact that this is an international conflict, that the international community does have a responsibility. And I think we can get it, we can get it back on the agenda if we insist on that, if we insist on the responsibility of our own governments to react to what its own constituents want them to do, and not to only be concerned about pleasing China and not offending China, which many governments have been doing for a long time. And I think now is a good time because now there is a pushback. For a first time after a long time, there is a realization that perhaps we have all gone too far in pleasing China and that this is now becoming a disadvantage for many countries. And so I think this is a good time to bring it back on the agenda.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for ending on a note of hope, and reminding us of the Baltic states, of East Timor, where, as you said, we were both working in the transition towards independence. And I remember thinking at that time, this is the general rehearsal for Tibet. Well, I still like to think it is, even though it is a number of years ago. I think your book will be very important in getting Tibet back on track. I'm showing my own copy. It has some yellow pads, but the book is available on Amazon.com. Buy it, read it, even though the topic is maybe difficult for some, or it sounds very difficult or complicated. The book is very well written, and it is, you read it like it is a novel. You read through it from the beginning to the end. You want to know how this ends. And I hope, partially based again on this seminal work, Tibet will have a happy ending. That is what the international campaign continues to advocate for, to support the Tibetans' right to self-determination and negotiated solution to the Sino-Tibetan conflict. So I like really, Michael, to thank you, even though we don't see you. I was very happy we didn't lose your voice in this Tibet talk. It's called Tibet Talk after all. So we have been able to talk. And Inge, thank you for posing the questions, and the audience, thank you for being with us and for posing such good critical questions to Michael. So thank you to all, and hope to see you next time during our next Tibet Talks. This talk will be on our Facebook and also on our website, so if you want to see it again, there is a chance to do so after we close this session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Michael. Thank you.